This is the second reference to swords that you've seen today. So we're definitely going a little bit medieval on this talk. So covenants without the sword. This is a famous phrase from Thomas Hobbes, who famously wrote the Leviathan, came up with social contract theory, and he made the argument that you cannot have covenants without the sword. And that covenants without the sword are basically just words and words of wind for people who are fans of Game of Thrones. I want to make the argument that in cybersecurity, at least, some of those covenants do exist and they are quite effective. There we go. So the conventional wisdom in cybersecurity, especially for the last 20 years or so, has been that companies do not have an incentive to invest in cybersecurity. And this kind of conventional wisdom was most well articulated in the seminal paper by Ross Anderson, who recently passed away, titled, "Why is Information Security Hard?" And he makes the argument that the problem with information security is not that it's technically hard to do. It's just, you have all of these misaligned incentives, which is why people don't have an incentive to invest in cybersecurity. So, for example, there's a problem with information asymmetry. So if you are trying to buy a new product, you cannot differentiate between two similar products on cybersecurity. So because you cannot differentiate those, a vendor has no incentive to build cybersecurity in. And so over time, you get a market of lemons in cybersecurity. And then based on that, other researchers have made recommendations on, what are some policy interventions we can have. So some people have made the argument that maybe you should have liability in software, right? You can have cyber insurance to transfer some of that risk. And there, again, I'm not going to go deep into this, but there are limitations to all of these policy proposals that other academics and researchers have expounded upon. There we go. So on the one side, people are making the argument, for 20 years, that there is no incentive to invest in cybersecurity. But on the other hand, when you look at the market of cybersecurity, well, that was $3.4 billion globally in 2003. If you look at 2001 to 2021 to 2025, it's now at 1.5 trillion cumulatively over those 4 or 5 years. Your cumulative average growth rate for companies in the cybersecurity market is somewhere between 12% to 20%. So that's significantly over the 7% that is typically you'd get out of like S&P 500, right? So if you don't have an incentive to invest in cybersecurity, but at the same time you see the cybersecurity market grow at this speed, well, someone's spending money, right? And they're spending money not out of the goodness of their hearts because they have an incentive to spend money. So the thing that I have been sort of interested in is like, what are those incentives to invest money into cybersecurity? And there's 7 that I've outlined here. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but let's take one of them. There we go. Let's hopefully, sorry, the color contrast is not great, but let's talk about proprietary information, right? So if you're any company, you want to protect your IP, anything that basically gives you competitive advantage in the marketplace, right? So if you work for a media company, for example, you would want to protect your TV shows or music or whatever other kind of media you invest in. If you work for Roblox, I'm sure you want to protect your proprietary code. Because you don't want other people to be able to just copy the Roblox platform. Sorry for picking on you. Another is integrated ecosystem. So for certain kinds of services, having security is kind of contingent for your ability to be able to provide that service. So think of, e-commerce, right? If you were not sure that every time you made an online transaction, let's say you went to Etsy and bought something, someone could just copy your credit card details and buy stuff willy-nilly all over the internet, you probably wouldn't be spending money on Etsy, right? I think if you roll the kind of clock back 20 years ago and you said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to send a strange, you're going to look up something on your phone, a stranger is going to come to your place, ask you for your credit card information, and then drive you to wherever you want, which is kind of business model on Uber and Lyft and all those things. You wouldn't kind of get into that unless you had some assurance that, the entire infrastructure on that was somehow secure and reliable. So, that integrated ecosystem piece is quite important. And then branding. Of course, there's certain companies that have their entire product portfolio branded around this notion that they actually provide, better security. There are lots of companies that, people gravitate to because they feel, greater trust in the security that they provide. So there are lots of basically market incentives to invest in security. So, just kind of coming to the conclusion of the talk, this notion that you cannot have commoners without the sword, well, Thomas Hobbes came up with it at a time when, the English society was falling apart. They had just come out of a civil war. He really wanted to impress the notion that you should have a central authority because the king was paying his bills, okay? And for the people who were not, getting paid by the king, there were criticisms of Hobbesian theory from, the likes of John Locke. Now, some of you might feel that John Locke is a little bit too out there for you. Well, in that case, you can look at, more recent scholars like Elinor Ostrom, who have talked about community-based self-governance, won the Nobel Prize in Economics, not the Peace Prize, but the Nobel Prize in Economics for that work in 2010. And she makes the argument that we need to be humble and realize that we do not always know the best way to manage resources in all settings. So the notion that you can have a centralized authority who can actually tell you how to do things better is not necessarily true in every context. So you have to look at other ways of governance. So what I'm trying to basically make the argument that I'm not saying that, you don't necessarily need any kind of policy interventions in cybersecurity, but as policymakers are designing those policy interventions, they have to think about where incentives exist, what is the strength and impact of those incentives, and then think about, basically having targeted interventions in places where those incentives are weak or they do not exist. If you would like to read the whole paper, there's a QR code for you to scan. That's all I got.